Let's see. Okay, let's start. And good evening. Tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the ethical question of taxation on churches. But I wanted to start off by giving you a little quote from Cindy Adams, who used to be an editor at the New York Post, and she said that one must take pride in paying up to the government every April 15th. She said, look at it this way. If you don't spend your money on the IRS, you probably just squander it on something foolish like rent or clothing. And I know that sometimes these IRS jokes can be a little funny, but when you stop and think about it, the reality of the situation is pretty heavy. Just for example, in 2010, the IRS collected in tax revenue from the American people in excess of $2.5 trillion. Now that number is kind of astounding, except when you think about the fact that they also in that same year spent $3.8 trillion. So with a spending rate at about 1.5 times the rate of revenue, it doesn't take a CPA to figure out that there's no way a budget like that is sustainable. And so we're left with two choices. We either have to curb our spending or raise revenue, or both. The question I'm asking is whether or not we want to begin to do that by taxing the offering plate. Is that the solution to our problem? By listening to this presentation, you will realize that the IRS has neither the precedence nor the constitutional authority to tax churches or other religious organizations. Now, as a pastor, I am deeply concerned about the ability of the church to meet the needs of our local communities without the added burden of taxes. Now, I've been studying the history of church and state relations for many years. I've read countless books on constitutional role of government and church affairs. And as a pastor, I'm also required to be somewhat knowledgeable of the IRS code as it pertains to 501c3 organizations. While advocating for churches' rights to remain tax exempt, I will present evidence from the U.S. founding documents that justifies my position, present a troubling story about how the government can overstep its boundaries, and discuss why churches should operate under a different set of rules than other organizations. The simple fact is, the U.S. government has no right to interfere through taxation or any other means the practice of free religion. The First Amendment of the Constitution protects not only the people from a state-sponsored church, but it also protects churches from invasive practices from the government. In 1802, in a letter that he addressed to the Danbury Baptist Association in Connecticut, President Thomas Jefferson used these words to elaborate the First Amendment. He said, and I quote, "I contemplate with sovereign reverence the act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibit the free practice thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state." End quote. It's obvious that from the beginning of our country, our founders wanted to protect our religious freedom from any form of government suppression or intervention. And we have all seen what government intervention looks like. In fact, there was a story that ran on 60 Minutes back in February of 1993 about the Fowler Trucking Company of Yonkers, New York. Now, the Fowler Company, like a lot of other small businesses around our country, was family-owned and operated. They saved up their money for years and invested everything that they had in the building of this trucking company. They built it up until they were running about 30 employees. But during the mid-'80s, they fell into some economic hard times in New York, and so they went behind on some of their payments to the IRS. Well, when the IRS began to stick them with all of their excessive fees and all of the high interest rate, they continued to get further and further behind. And finally, just before Christmas, the IRS came in and seized their bank accounts, all of their personal holdings, and seized all of the property that belonged to the company, including office furniture and the picture frames on the walls, so that they could sell all these items at auction in order to retain some of their money. Their actions not only put 30 people on the unemployment line, but they also indiscriminately destroyed a small business and ruined the dreams of the family. Can you imagine the IRS seizing a church for back taxes? Can you imagine the IRS taking the altar from the sanctuary and selling it at an auction in order to pay your taxes? Now, I understand that some people believe that since churches own property and since they're involved in social issues that they should be subject to the same rules as other organizations. But we must keep in mind that churches do not earn profit. They do not pay dividends to shareholders, and they do not sell products or services as normal means of business. Churches function differently. And so the tax rules must therefore be different. Now, I have argued today that churches should remain tax exempt by presenting evidence from our founding fathers and their intent concerning church and state relations. With a heartbreaking story about how the IRS can destroy an organization, I've illustrated why churches should remain tax exempt. And I have discussed why churches should follow a different set of rules than other organizations. The only way to protect our freedom is to exercise it. If you want to ensure that the IRS does not gain control of America's faith-based organizations, then please contact your representatives and make your voice heard. Thank you.